live in 5, 4, you're live.
Well, hello everybody. I was going to teach on a very specific subject this week, and my teaching is gone. Cannot find it anywhere. I do not know where it went. So I've got a series of teachings that I am getting ready to do. We're getting ready to go live. I don't know if you guys, well, we are live, but I mean, we're getting ready to go nationwide. And for that matter, we already are nationwide. What am I trying to say? We're getting ready to go mainstream television. Let's put it that way. Of course, these days, mainstream means interweb. It doesn't mean ABC, NBC, and those things. Those companies, I don't know if you guys know this, but those companies are literally going bankrupt because they're not doing anything to keep up with the times, other than they are buying out all of the companies that were and destroying those companies as well. But anyway, they will not be able to destroy the interweb. There'll always be another company coming along that will always be doing something to, take up the slack. Roku is one of those companies that looked ahead and thought, hey, we could do a thing. And so we're going to show up on Roku and pretty much anywhere you can get a podcast. We're going to wind up there. We'll be on Apple. We'll be, you name it, we'll be there. So in order to catch up with the times, we're going to have to take some steps to maybe take me back in time a little. Can't make me look young. Well, I guess we could, but we can't afford that. So we won't be making me look any younger, but we do need to reach a little bit of a younger crowd. So I'm going to do some teachings, and what I'm going to do is spend some time now whether I do these things as a Sabbath thing is not very likely, but today I'm going to take some practice runs at it so that I can go back and watch it and see what I think maybe needs to be done. I've got to be a lot less boring for these, which is probably not going to happen. I want to go through just some thoughts here. They would be broken up, as it were, into very short segments. But what I've done is I've created a new translation of the New Testament. Now, this translation is not a Christian translation because it didn't lead me there. I took the Greek text. I took all of the grammar, that's not the word I'm looking for, punctuation out of that text because there was no punctuation at the time it was written. And I started from scratch. Every last word that you read in my translation, I typed it. It was not me looking at somebody else's English translation and turning it into a new translation. This was me looking at a Greek, not translation, but a Greek text. Now, whether it's the best one that is out there may be debatable. I think it is, but that can be debatable amongst the Greek nerds, which no doubt will happen. So anyway, to try to give you an idea of what's going on here, I'm going to start off with the very first thing that we have to know. The church, as we know it today, did not exist when the man, Jesus, as he's called by the church, and very incorrectly, by the way, that was not his name, but it didn't exist in that time period. So we got to talk about this. How do I know that? Well, because in the official church history that was written by a man called Eusebius, he said so. Let me look at this. It's called the Eusebius Ecclesiastical, good Lord, history. Now it states, trying to find it on the screen here. It states that the word Christianos was being used for the very first time, in place of the word ecclesiasticus, for the first time. Now we're talking, this is circa 330 CE. So what does that mean? That means this is 300 years after the cross. He is saying 300 years after the cross, the word Christianos is being used of this congregation to name this so-called congregation for the very first time. What should that tell us? Well, we know that Christianos, you can hear it. You can hear the word Christian, right? I'm not just making that up. So you're like, well, just because they said Christianos doesn't mean that they weren't talking about Christians. Okay, I'll give you that sort of. This word is being used of this congregation for the very first time 300 years after the cross. So we have a problem here because in the New Testament translation in English, it says they were first called Christians at Antioch. Eusebius was not at Antioch. And what's the word Christian doing in a first century text? You're talking about something that was supposedly written by the people who followed Yeshua, the guy that's called Jesus now. These men who actually followed him were called his Talmidim because they were speaking Hebrew in those days, not Aramaic. We call them disciples. These are the people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. None of them had those names. These are names that were assigned to them when the church, as it were, was told to separate itself from all things Jewish. So these men were given Latin and Greek names. And so we've got this thing happening here. Why would this word be used at Antioch? So first off, we know that it was not used at Antioch for the first time. What they were called was Ha-Meshichi, because again, they were speaking Hebrew, not Aramaic. It wasn't until the 1800s that it literally became a thing that people began to believe that the language of the Bible was Aramaic. No, it wasn't. The historical information tells us otherwise. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirms it beyond a shadow of a doubt. But that's for another time. So they were called Meshihi, which meant followers of Messiah. Before, during, and after this place called Antioch. And these people were actually called the Hasidim in the New Testament Bibles. You know how I know this? Well, what were they called in the New Testament? What's that English word we keep seeing? Saints, the saints, the saints, the saints, the saints, the saints. And the funny thing is, you've got all these scholars saying, boy, we don't know what happened to the Hasidim. They just disappeared. Have you ever read a Bible? The saints, the saints, the saints. You know what Hasidim means? Saints, saints, saints. We know where they went. There's no doubt about where they went. They went in the New Testament. Come on now. And if you read this letter that was written by Eusebius, there's a couple of things that you realize. If you have the version of it that I have, where on one page, on the left side of the page, it's got, I think the Greek is on the left, I haven't read it in a while, and the English is on the right. They don't match. Because the stuff that says it in English matches your Bible, and the stuff in the Greek didn't know what your Bible was. And so it does not match. And what you're getting over here is somebody making it say what they want it to say because they don't want you to know that they were not Christians. They were not called Christians at Antioch. They were not called the church. That none of that's, the church didn't exist until the 1500s. 1500s. I'm not making that up. Google it. I don't know if that's the safest thing to do, but you can at least try it. I'm not making it up, though. No, the church was not established until the 1500s. That's when it became established. And by the 1600s, very early into it, because by the late 1800s or 1500s, they were trying to put together a Bible that came out as the King James Bible. They weren't writing that. Google this, because I know this is on Google. These people wrote to King James and said, we want to write a Bible, and we want to put out a Bible that conforms to the Church of England, this newly formed entity. They wanted to make a book that conformed to them. It says that. It doesn't say we want to put a book out that has an accurate translation. No, it didn't say that. It said we want it to conform to the Church of England. What do you think you get? Do you think you get the truth that way? When you study to prove that which you already believe, do you think you're going to get the truth? Well, you're sadly mistaken if you do, because you won't. You'll find everything under the sun that backs up what you believe. But if you take this text for what it says the biggest complaint that Eusebius had was that he could not believe that people would dare to teach from these letters not being philosophers. These were not rabbis. These weren't even Christians. They couldn't have been, because Christianity didn't exist. All you had was, at this time, philosophy. You didn't even have the Catholic Church. No, the Catholic Church was not started by Constantine. It wasn't around when Eusebius was alive. And who's the other guy that wrote all the junk that the New Testament's taken from? Want to say his name starts with an N. Why can't I think of his name? All I can think of is Nostradamus. That's not right. No. The philosopher guy that was the head of the temple, and he was smarter than everybody else, and so they brought him in, and he put together a New Testament and supposedly the Old, which is very questionable because he didn't seem to know his Hebrew at all. Dadgummit, why am I not thinking of this guy's name? I'm dead in the water here. I don't have any clue what that man's name was, or what the name of his stupid document is that every Bible is based on. Every last one of them. Even the New Testament Greek, when they finally did that in the 14, 15, and 1600s, it was based on the Latin Vulgate. Okay, now I finally remembered the book. Who is credited with writing it?
Jerome.
No, good. Jerome, yeah. Origin. What? Origin was way too far back. Jerome. Oh. There was no Catholicism. They did not name it Catholicism until the middle 400s. Jerome was dead by then. He finished that document in the very early 400s, just before his death. He was already gone when they came up with the word Catholic. And all that was the culmination of Constantine, Eusebius, and Jerome, all three trying to come up with a name for this entity they were developing. Because what they were doing was developing something that was... they were trying to develop a religion that would include everybody. They wanted a universal, that's what we're looking for, a universal religion. You know what the Catholic word for universal is? A Catholic word. That's not the right word. Latin. You know what the Latin word for universal is? Catholic. That's why in the middle to late 400s, they finally came up with the name. They kept saying, we need a Catholic religion. We need a Catholic. Oh, why don't you just call it the Catholic religion? Whoa, eureka! But that was, again, after all three of those men were dead. They were already worm dirt by this time. Just saying. Worm food. Yeah, that's the right word. So this wasn't religion. It was philosophy. You had people who were trained in the thinking of Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, particularly Plato. This was their training. And they spoke the Greek language. They did not speak the Hebrew language. So they couldn't look at the Hebrew Bible. They couldn't look at the Hebrew New Testament, because it was, by the way, entirely written in Hebrew. But they couldn't look at that stuff because they couldn't understand it. They couldn't read it because they couldn't understand it. So everything that they used was either the Latin Vulgate. Is that the right word? No. Good Lord, Robert. The Greek Septuagint. Oy, oy, oy. I'm going to have to write this stuff down, aren't I? Can't do this off the top of my head. I haven't had enough coffee, I think. Anyway, so this is the first thing we got to know, is that there is no such thing as a first century church. There were no Christians at Antioch. No Christian was suffered for the sake of God, for the sake of Christianity. Not one of them ever were. They weren't there, so it didn't happen. What I'm trying to tell you is all of this church history prior to the 450s. Well, now I'm gonna jump earlier to the 320s time, because this is Eusebius. Prior to Eusebius, there was no such thing as anything other than Judaism over here and philosophy over there. The philosophers didn't have a Bible. They didn't have a book of philosophy. You had some writings of Aristotle, and you had some writings of these other guys, but these men wouldn't have been able to get their hands on it for the most part. This stuff would have been passed down. And they needed something to work with. And are you going to just take something out of the pie in the sky and start preaching that to everybody and think you're going to get a big following? No. What you do is you take the Bible, the one thing that almost everybody has a little bit of. They don't have the whole thing, but they have a little bit of it. The Greek world, certainly there's a lot of people that are going to have a lot of the Septuagint in these early days was just the first 5 books of the Bible. It was not the rest of it. That came later. Probably around this time period. Yeah, actually, I think it is around that time period that they started finally finishing the rest of it. But the first, early on in the first century in particular, they only had the first 5 books. Just like the Jews, they had more of the what the Christians call the Old Testament than the first 5, but you would never have met anybody with every one of them, because what they would have had were scrolls. They didn't have books back then. Books first came along in the late 1st century CE. That's when you first started seeing something that actually looks like a book. It wasn't called a book. It wasn't thought of as a book, and technically it really wasn't a book. But that's the first time you start getting squared off sheets, if you will, and they weren't exact because they didn't have machines to cut them off all nice and pretty and glue them all together. None of that existed in that time, but they were starting to actually look like books by the end of the 1st century. And that was still not the prevalent thing. Most people had scrolls still. And these scrolls were skins from particularly of sheep, because the Jews were real particular about that. But among the Romans and the other non-Jewish people, they didn't mind skinning a deer and writing on that. That was no problem for them. So you saw a lot of that in the Greek. Most of it burned, by the way, but there was some that survived. But anyway, this is what they had. And so maybe if you're Jewish, you're going to have the book of Leviticus or maybe the book of Deuteronomy. And if you're really, really rich, or maybe not so much that, maybe your parents sprung for that. Because to buy one of those books, just say you're going to get the book of Leviticus, the letter of Leviticus, if you will. It's thick enough to be a book. We'll call it that. We'll call it the book of Leviticus. Let's say you're rich enough that you can pay an entire year's salary, because that's what it cost you back then, an entire year's salary. Why? Because it took an entire year to write one. It took a man an entire year of his life to write you one of those. So it cost you a year's salary. And so if you could afford that, you would keep that and pass it down to your kids. Well, now, if your son was fairly wealthy or could afford to spend a year of his salary on something like that, maybe he would buy another book. Maybe he'd buy Isaiah, because it'd be more likely that he would do that than to buy another book that says almost the same thing as the previous. So it's not likely that they would be buying each book of the Torah. What they would want to go beyond that and get something from the prophets. Or maybe they want to get something from, the book of Psalm, or maybe the Wisdom of Solomon. Those would be very attractive books. And over time, maybe somebody would have 4 or 5 of those, but it would have been passed down. Not very likely somebody could have afforded all of those. And then when they died, if they didn't have anyone to pass it on to, it would almost surely go to a synagogue. You follow where I'm going with this? People didn't have all of that stuff. And so these philosophers would pick these popular books, and they would read them and translate them through the eyes and the mindset of these philosophers. And Eusebius's biggest complaint was, you can't believe it, these people aren't even philosophers. These rabbis actually stupidly think they understand this. Really? That was written by rabbis, you moron. Man, if I could kick that guy right now, I would. But that's your church historian. And he didn't say, hey, the church was created on the day of Pentecost and the fire came down and God said, "Fooey on the Jewies." No, he didn't teach any of that nonsense. That's a 1900s invention. Yeah, 1900s. I don't know about you, but I was born in the 1900s. Just say it. Yeah. In my lifetime. Okay. What was I saying? What happened in the 1900s?
Teaching that the Jews, God.
Oh, yeah. That God washed his hands of the Jews. Because here's the basic teaching. God couldn't get the Jews to do what he asked them to do, so he kicked them out and took on the Christians and didn't give them any rules at all. Good luck selling God on that one when you stand in front of him. I'm just saying, oh my God. That is basic. That is the foundation, the founding principle of all Christianity today. Am I against Christianity? Well, yeah, I kind of am. But do I think that they're all going to hell? No, I don't. So let's get that straight. I'm not on that bandwagon. I don't believe that Christians are going to hell because they're lost. I believe that they're in hell because they're lost. Because hell is here. You really think hell is there? You don't get saved in heaven. You don't need it. You don't need salvation in heaven. Salvation is needed here. Why? Because this is the valley of the shadow of death. And if you don't live according to God's law, you live in hell right now. And that's what you need salvation from. Because without a covenant with God, without being in covenant with God, you are living in a living hell. And hell is worse for some than others. Just saying. God is a just God. Anyway, I think I've said enough about that. Let me move on to another one. Let's have some more fun. Okay. So the first thing I was teaching, the reason why I was trying to tell you the first thing you need to know is that there's no such thing as a first century church and all that. You have to know that because everything that you know about Christianity, everything you know about your New Testament is a lie. It's literally a lie. It wasn't translated so that you would know what it really said. It was translated so you would live your life according to the way the people who were running things wanted you to live your life. They wanted you to sit in front of a television like a certain person just recently did and tell everybody all about how you're supposed to obey the laws of the land and how God put the laws of the land in place. Oh my God. These were Jewish rabbis who wrote these letters. And what they were talking about was Judaism, Jewish God, Jewish people. Everything was Jewish. And so when they said God established the law of the land, they were not talking about the American Constitution. They were not talking about some lady in Michigan being a tyrant over her people, with her husband running around telling everybody, hey, but I'm the governor's husband. You ought to give me special treatment. No, it was nothing like that. It had nothing to do with that because it wasn't recognized by these people. The only law of the land that exists to the Jew is the one in the Bible. Oh, well, but you got to obey the law of the land. Well, why not? Why not? If it says to go 55, it's probably best that you go 55 because if you don't, you're going to get a ticket if you get caught. Yeah, we all know that. Yeah, and if it says go 65, that's probably what you ought to do. But if it says that you ought not serve God because we're trying to protect all the people, come on. Really? You don't get this COVID disease going to Walmart every day, going to your grocery store every day, going to Lowe's and what's the other one? Home Depot all day. You can go there all day long, all night long. No problem. But you can't go to your church. You can't go to your synagogue. You can't go where. No. This is the godless forcing their will on the stupid. Now, I'm not telling you that Jesus is going to protect you and you can't get COVID going to your church or going to your synagogue or even going to your mosque. I'm not going to tell you that. COVID is out there. People are getting it. Mostly old people are dying from it because the 6 states where most of the deaths are occurring. Did you know that 62% of all of the deaths occurred in 6 states? And all of them governed by governors who wrote a, what do you call that? It's not a law. It's a, no, the thing that Obama said, I got a pen. What? Executive order. These people wrote executive orders forcing old folks' homes, places where these people are basically going so that they can live out the rest of their life until they're dead. These are the weakest, most vulnerable people that we have out there. And from day flipping one, we knew that it was particularly bad for the old people. And these 6 governors made it mandatory that these people take in people with COVID. They had people in their 20s that were perfectly fine. They were asymptomatic, as it's called. They didn't have a single symptom. They were being quarantined in the one place where people had the least chance of surviving. And it's those 6 states in those old folks' homes where 62% of all of the death in America took place. Yet these same people are saying, you can't go to church. Really? You can't go to synagogue. Really? And they're running out and taking license plates and reading women their Miranda rights while they're giving somebody a haircut outside, the safest place anybody could possibly be. No, no, no. We were not told to obey them. Under no circumstances are they going to tell us that we can or cannot worship our God. Under no circumstances do they have the right to tell us that we, where and when we can and cannot worship our God. Now, does that mean that we should all show up together and start, swapping spit and hugging each other and loving on each other and spreading the love and what? No. This thing's real. It's nothing like what they're telling us it is, but it is real, and it can potentially be dangerous, especially to some of us that are, over 20 or so. I'm just saying, I might be in that danger zone myself. I can tell you that a mask does nothing. That's stupid. That's beyond stupid. It does nothing. Because you can't make one that's going to stop the spread of that sort of a virus. You'd have to spend $10,000 to get a microscope that's powerful enough to even see it. It's that small. So that no, your mask is not going to stop that. But look at what they're doing. Well, there's some people really, really having their way with this, right? This is not what we do. This is not what we do. What we do is we protect ourselves the best way we can. We probably go to our congregation and don't shake hands. We go to our congregation and we don't go hugging everybody, right? We can be responsible. We don't need a government telling us how to be, because the law of God teaches us the way to do that. Now, maybe the Christians are, because they won't live by God's law. He doesn't have the right to tell them what to do because he had a bouncing baby boy that went down there and died so that you don't have to obey God anymore. Whatever. No. The Bible tells us to be prudent. It tells us to be safe. And when we didn't know what was going on, it was probably better that we didn't go to service. But after a couple of weeks, we realized what was going on. At least I hope that our people in this congregation realized we were being lied to. And that there were some people out there that wanted the death toll to go as high as they could possibly get it. I don't understand these kind of people. That's what you call the difference between the darkness and the light. These people are so lost in their darkness that they think the thing to do is put young people who have COVID in with old people who are going to die from it. That's some serious darkness. And it's out there. And we live in a place where there's a lot of darkness surrounding us. But if we live like them, if we walk like them, if we talk like them, if we dress like them, how much deeper is our darkness? So we are in and among them, but we're not of them. We are not them. But that doesn't make us better than them. The difference is they're living in hell. And it's so bad people are killing themselves at a higher rate than ever before. That's how bad that darkness is. And so we're going to go and hide in our houses while God's house sits empty. There's something familiar about one of those words. I think I read that in the Bible. They need this message worse now than ever before. Ever before. But the first thing we need to know is God's law is the law of the land. God's law is the law that God put into place. Are we under the law of this land? Yeah, we are. And if this place becomes Soviet-style socialism, because they're not actually communist. They call themselves communists, but they're not. They're socialists. But if we become that, we're living in a bad place. a really, really bad place. And so we got to stand up against it as best as we can. And we have to obey the laws that make sense, the laws that are for our protection, not the laws that they say are for our protection, like putting a stupid mask on your face. That's not for your protection. That doesn't protect you, and it doesn't protect anybody else. Hey, we turned it into a fashion thing, though. Donna found one with a dog face on it, and other various things, and we just rocked it because even though they were not laws, they were just, what'd you say? The thing?
City ordinance?
No.
Oh.
The executive orders. Even though they were, executive orders are not laws. Our Constitution says that only Congress will write laws. Hello. Congress didn't write any of those laws. And is that just the Congress in Washington? No. That's why we have a Congress in each state. They write laws that are pertinent to, that's not the word I was looking for. Specific to the state, right? And then your counties do the same thing. No, they don't. They write ordinances. They can't write laws. Again, it has to be your Congress that writes. So these were not laws, people. But I don't want to go and get arrested and spend a month in jail being treated like a... I mean, they emptied our jails of the people who were truly criminals and started putting hairdressers in them because they weren't wearing a mask or because they were opening their business. Things are out of control. But this is what we're here for. We're here for the light because we are the light of the world. If the light of God's word is in us, then we are the light of the world because we're living our life in this terrible place. And people can say, there's something different about that guy. He doesn't seem to want to kill himself. He seems to be enjoying life. You know what I'm saying? We're not the ones living in hell. And people will notice that when they're living in hell. At least we shouldn't be the ones. That's why we live according to God's law, because it takes us out of that place. And sometimes we forget. Yeah, we do. Anyway, I forgot why I went down that road. But let's talk about a couple of things. Do I have time? I don't have a timer today. Okay. Let's move on. Let's talk about something else that is the reason why your Bible is not accurate. No matter whether you're Jewish or Christian, it doesn't make any difference. Your Bible's not accurate. And let me tell you why. There's at least 3 more reasons I can think of right now. The first is because translators are building on a false foundation created by this altered reality and thinking that that the church and Christianity is in this place. It's not. So we got to take all of that out. We got to back all of that out because we're living in a false reality. Your foundation is improper. There's all this talk about artificial intelligence. That is the biggest bunch of BS you're ever going to hear in your life. And they've been trying to convince us of it for decades, at least 4 decades. They have been trying to convince you that the day is going to come when a computer takes over the world. It cannot. It will not. It is baloney. A computer is an inanimate object. It cannot think for itself. If someone says, oh, well, this computer watched the guy trim the tree, so now it knows how to trim a tree. Really? Okay, so your computer has arms and it has legs and it looks like the Arnold Schwarzenegger thing from that End of the World movie, and it's going to walk over there and it's going to take out a buzzsaw in its hand and zip, zip, zip. Even if you could do that, do you know how that would happen? Would it happen from a computer looking at a guy doing it and saying, oh, I get it? No. It would come from somebody writing the code into that computer, telling it what it should deduce from what it saw. It can only know what it's told to know. It cannot know for itself. It is utterly impossible. When you show me a hammer that can talk to you about how to build a house, then we'll talk about me believing in artificial intelligence. It's not. The only intelligence that is in there is the intelligence that was put there. So when they tell you, oh, It was an algorithm, and it accidentally got rid of all of that stuff and those tweets and whatnot. They are lying through their teeth. It did exactly what it was told to do, because that's all a computer can do. Anywho, so we know that there's no such thing as a first century church. Christianity, more specifically Catholicism, did not exist until after the time of Constantine's war. The ante-Nicene, or church fathers as they are known, were philosophers. They were not religious leaders. They were philosophers. In their time, they used religious writings, especially the New Testament letters, as a basis for their philosophical musings, a practice that had been around since the beginning of philosophical, not religious, thought. Philosophical thought, in other words, because that was fairly new in that time as well. It had only been around a few 600 years maybe, if we push it as far out as we possibly can. And that's being very generous, I think. Secondly, Greek and English grammar have no place in the ancient Hebrew world. We must separate ourselves from our need to understand Hebrew and English. In other words, we must divorce ourselves from the English language, customs, culture, history, grammar, typology, typography, archaeology. I mean, you name it. You have to divorce yourself from it and understand the Hebrew text in the Hebrew language if we are ever going to accurately translate the writings in the times of the Bibles. Thirdly, Christian history has no place in these letters. They are Jewish and thus connected only to Jewish history. Though I have taken great pains to show the connection between the letters and Rabbinic Judaism in these translations that I'm talking about, a word of caution is needed, and it's very, very important here. We have to be careful when we're comparing rabbinic passages from the wrong time period. For example, something expressed by a sage during the Dark Ages should scarcely be applied in the life and times of the first century, though at times it is what they're talking about did come from the first century. More often than not, it did not. It's something that's basically made up. If we're not careful, it will at times become a case of art imitating life, in that it is possible, perhaps even likely, that a sage from the Dark Ages is attempting to wipe away some interpretation by writing that some rabbi, in the name of some other rabbi somewhere in the past, used to say something that has never been heard before this guy, but now somehow proves that his interpretation is right and the previous interpretation is wrong. You find this very heavy in the writings of the Dark Ages. The sages, Maimon, Nachman, who else? Rashi, and on it goes. These guys basically made stuff up, just made it up. They didn't know anything about the Hebrew customs, culture, and history. What they were doing was making it up because they had become so far removed from the Bible itself. They didn't even read it in Hebrew. None of them spoke the language. They read it in Aramaic or Arabic. Maimonides was all Aramaic, I think. Am I right about that? No, Arabic. Arabic's what I'm trying to say. Arabic. Aramaic is the normal one for Rashi and all of those guys, but I think Maimonides was Arabic because he was basically a Muslim and lived in the Muslim world. Whoa. I just messed up my computer pretty bad. Anywho. Well, now my finger won't even move the stuff up and down. I don't know why. Oinky doinky then. Oh, wow. I have totally had enough of that. We're going old style here. We're going old school. That's what I meant to say. If I can find it. No, I think I'm in the wrong place. Okay. So we got to watch what we're doing when we're taking this information from the sages and trying to connect it to the New Testament. Why did I do that? Well, I did that because I'm trying to show the Jewish population that I'm trying to reach out to here that this and the Christians, these teachings in the New Testament were not new. These teachings were from what the Christians call the Old Testament, all of them, because the people who wrote these letters did not have a New Testament. Hello, it's these letters that they wrote. These were Jewish leaders of the synagogues writing letters to the Jewish leaders of other synagogues concerning matters of the Jewish religion in these letters. And they were basing everything that they knew on the Tanakh, predominantly the Torah, but not completely. I mean, because a lot of what they taught came out of the prophets and the writings. So, but predominantly the law, because everything in the law, the prophets and the writings is based on the law. So in the end, you're always going to tie your way all the way back to the law with these men. They did not have a New Testament to teach from. They did not teach anything Christian. It simply didn't exist in their world. So we have to know that. We have to know where this stuff came from. We have to know that these men spoke Hebrew, not Aramaic. I'm not saying that none of them spoke Aramaic. There's no proof that a single one of them did, but it's beyond Yeshua. He certainly spoke some Aramaic when he was on the cross, which proves beyond a shadow of a doubt in my mind that they didn't speak Aramaic because there wasn't a Jew there that had any idea what the man was saying. Oh, he's crying out to Elijah. No, he wasn't. He said in Aramaic, Eli, Eli. Kind of sounds like the shortened version of Elijah, doesn't it? Eli, Eli. They didn't say Elijah. They said Eliyahu. So they're thinking, this guy's calling out to Elijah. Why? Because he wasn't speaking Hebrew. So I think that we've got some pretty solid evidence just there alone. Never mind all of the evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls and all that. But we have to set the foundation proper before we can begin to know what's right. Because that's what I was going to say. Garbage in a computer, garbage out. I think that if we've learned anything from this mess going on around us, it should have taught us that AI is not real. Because garbage in, garbage out. What happens? So first we get this guy from London. He writes this, he shows this thing. It says bazillions of people are going to die. And everybody panicked. But did everybody follow that? No, the news would have you believe they did, but they didn't. What they followed was something put out by the Bill and Melinda Gates firm. That's where it came from. Their numbers were lower, but their numbers were still way out of whack. I mean, they said that they were going to need 140,000 beds in New York to cover the COVID virus, and they only needed 19,000. That's kind of a big difference, isn't it? Not as bad as the guy out of London, but it's still way out of whack. Well, why didn't the AI, by the most brilliantest computer scientist that's ever lived, how come his stuff was... there wasn't a single prediction he gave that was anywhere close. It wasn't even remotely close. Because garbage in, garbage out. Whatever you teach this machine, if you teach it to be stupid, it's going to be stupid. If you teach it to be brilliant, good luck with that. It ain't going to happen. If you teach it to, teaching it math is easy because it's logical. 1 + 1 = 2. That's logic. That's all it can do. It can't be emotional. You cannot teach it to be emotional. If you try to teach it to be emotional, what you do is get garbage in and garbage out. Anyway, that's why I was telling you that stuff. There was another thing that's going on with this messianic group. How much time do I have? Okay. One of the other things that goes on with this messianic group, and I was a part of this for a while, was what we were doing was taking the Deluge New Testament, and we were taking everything that we took from the Bible back to the Deluge. Why? Because it's written in Hebrew. So we're like, yeah, now we can go back and we can look at the Deluge and we know what the Hebrew word is. And so now we can look that up in our little Hebrew dictionary and we can truly know what it says, except there's a problem here. Deluge, I think he used the King James Bible to translate from. Everybody says, oh yeah, he used Greek. How do you know that? Because he didn't say he did. It's other people after he was dead saying that he did. Now, maybe somebody can show me it otherwise, but that's all I've found so far. But I can tell you that if it was Greek that he used, it was pretty much the same one they used to write the King James Bible. Because here's the problem. All of the nonsense that was added, see, in the King James, these guys are saying, good Lord, look at this. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, none of their stories are matching up. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit out of John and stick it in Luke. We're going to take a little bit out of Luke and we're going to put it in Matthew. And then we're going to take a little bit of Matthew and put it over here with, who's the other guy? Matthew, Mark. And we're going to jam up all this stuff. We're going to move all this stuff around. And then it's going to try to make everything look a little more the same. But the more they tried, the worse it got. Now you have in two of the guys are telling the story of the man that's found in the place where people die, graveyard. They found in the graveyard. Two of them are saying, yeah, there was just one guy, and man, he was so crazy he could take steel irons and just break them off. Wow, that's pretty crazy. I would think you need strength, but whatever it takes. Yeah, this guy could take him, and they could throw him on the ground. He could just crush him up under his feet. And then the other guys are telling the story, and there's two of them. Yeah, Deluge did that. He followed that same thing, and I was like, what? No. You know what happens when you do that is you're perverting what the rabbi meant by what he wrote. Yes, some of them tell you that there's two, and some tell you that there was one. There's a reason for that. It's not about who's right and who's wrong, because these are not real stories. These are parables. And some people refer to the Jews as Israel. That's all encompassing. And some refer to them as Israel and Judah. But that was still encompassing. The Israel and Judah together added up to all Jews alive. So when they say there was one, that's somebody calling Israel, Israel. Just using the one word. So that's why there's one. Because the guy in the story represents Israel. Israel, not a single person, but all of Israel. And the people who are saying that there's two of them are calling it, they're representing Israel as Israel and Judah. They did that on purpose. But we lose that when we start trying to make it all the same story, trying to match it up. And then when people, hundreds of years later, somebody finally says, wait a minute, these guys are saying there's two and these guys are saying there's one. Now we get the apologist. Oh, well, see, both of them are right. Nobody can be wrong in these books because it's inspired, infallible, and inerrant. And so we have to have the apologist to pull it all together and make it all work. And what you call an apologist in real life, in my world, a bald-faced liar. Now, was he set out to be a bald-faced liar? No, he was just trying to make it all work. He thought he was doing a good thing. But in the end, he was a bald-faced liar. You know where that term comes from? Maybe I've told you this before. Maybe I haven't. I don't know for sure. But see, I don't have a bald face because I have a beard on my face. And I have a beard on my face because I follow God's law in everything, not just some things. And that's what we call the truth. But we also came up with this whole idea of if you shaved your face, you had a bald face. And you weren't following God's law, so you were of the lying persuasion, thus the bald-faced liar. And then in the 1800s, a writer, most likely Jewish, who knew this term and used this term, switched it to bold-faced liar, because the lying was being put in print. There's your history lesson for today. American history. So you got Deluge following this stuff, putting things in his translation that should not have been there. But the biggest problem that I had was that he switched off. Even when he was giving quotes from the Hebrew Bible, from what the Christians call the Old Testament, he was changing the words into modern Hebrew words. I refused to go there with him. And when he was using some words, he was giving them modern meaning. Some of the Hebrew words, even though he was using a biblical word, he was using the modern meaning instead of the biblical meaning, which is very prevalent today when these people, everybody going back to the Hebrew. They don't realize that the Hebrew they're going back to is a modern version of Hebrew and not the biblical Hebrew version. Because modern Hebrew teachers will teach you that the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is a cow. Oy, oy, oy. The very first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is going to break one of God's laws for us not to have graven images, and we're going to go out and we're going to draw these images and carve these images out so we can teach our kids how to do it. And the first thing we're going to do is a cow? The thing that they worshipped at Sinai? No, it's not a cow. It's an ox yoke. And some little kid somewhere along the way drew 2 eyes and a smiley face, and it became a cow. Do you follow? Anyway, I seem to be running out of time, but there were legitimate reasons why I say let's not take this and just take what we have, this false reality, this false foundation, and just give it Hebrew words. Let's take this back to the Hebrew that was used in the biblical time period. And let's put the meanings that go to that time period to this verse. And then we will realize that all of these teachings, all of these teachings in the New Testament came from Judaism. It came right out of the Jewish Bible, that book that Christians so wrongly call the Old Testament. That's all I'm going to be able to do today, but hopefully this, going back and watching myself, I don't ever watch myself. I hate to. It makes me so depressed. Not really that close. But I'm going to watch it, and we're going to try to find out some way to make this interesting and try to put it together where I'm not going, what's that word? What's that word? Make it a little more professional and see if we can start putting, I'm going to go through all of those things that are different in the New Testament and talk about why. And maybe that'll be more helpful than me trying to explain the New Testament, because boy, that takes a long time. Anyway, Shabbat Shalom, y'all.